Hello, welcome to the National Museum of Australia. My name is Libby Stewart and I'm a Senior Curator here at the museum. Today I'd like to talk to you about some objects from one of our permanent galleries, the Landmarks Gallery. The place I'm going to talk about today is Old Parliament House, one of Canberra's oldest and most loved buildings. I'm also going to talk about a couple of the people, the parliamentarians who lived and worked in this building and were trailblazers in their own right. Old Parliament House was the seat of Australia's federal parliament for a very long time, 61 years in fact, from 1927 until 1988. When Australia was federated in 1901, a decision was made at that point to have a new capital city that was outside both Sydney and Melbourne. But it took a long time, many years, for Canberra to be established and named. It wasn't until 1913 when Governor-General Lord Denman and his wife Lady Denman named Canberra as the capital. In the 1920s, an international competition was held to design the new national capital. And the architect who was successful, Walter Burley Griffin, and his wife Marion Marnie, a Chicago-based couple, designed a capital city that would eventually become known as the Bush Capital. The Parliament building was designed to be at the apex of a triangle, eventually known as the Parliamentary Triangle. But what became known as the Provisional Parliament was started in the early 1920s. The government architect of the day, John Smith Murdoch, was asked to design a building that would last 50 years. He designed it in what was known as the stripped classical look, a very minimalist look with a lot of natural light and a big white facade, white painted building that has become known very fondly as the wedding cake building. After the end of the First World War, the design and building of Canberra really picked up. A new brickworks was established to produce what became fondly known as the Canberra Reds, red bricks that were used to build not only the Provisional Parliament building, but many of the permanent buildings that still exist in Canberra today. So Old Parliament House was a very solidly built building, and even though it was temporary, it was quite advanced for its day. It had good heating, it had some cooling, of course the heating very much needed in Canberra's cold winters. It also had great recreation facilities. In this travel poster from the 1930s, taken from an aerial view of Canberra, you can see how the Parliament building was very much placed at the centre of Canberra. It was really the heart of the fledgling city, which took a long time to grow. Now, the opening of Old Parliament House, or the Provisional Parliament building, was a grand affair. The Duke of York, later to become, of course, King George VI, came out from England especially for the occasion. They stayed at a government house with the Governor-General. The Prime Minister, Stanley Bruce, who was the first Prime Minister in Canberra, was there proudly as well. Many people were expected to come, but of course Canberra was a very difficult place to get to in the 1920s. There were no highways coming in to the national capital. So although they had catered for a very large number of people, and there were people camped out in the frosty grounds around the building, there was way too much food. And there's a lovely story about the numbers of sausage rolls and pies and fish that were brought down by the caterers from Sydney in trucks and that ended up having to be thrown away. There are some stories that that leftover food formed the foundations of some of our government buildings, but that certainly is almost certainly not true. Nevertheless, the opening went ahead to great acclaim. Two Aboriginal men, Wiradjuri men, John Noble and Jimmy Clements, who had walked a long way, over 100 kilometres. They were elders. They'd come to Canberra to represent their story and be present at the opening of the Federal Parliament to mark their presence as the first Australians. Dame Nellie Melba, you can see in this photo on the front steps, sang the national anthem, God Save the King, but her voice was partly drowned out by a flyover of aircraft also marking the event. You can hear it in the very crackly soundtrack from that opening. But sadly, the flyover marked a sombre occasion on the day when one of the planes later crashed on a hillside not far from the building and the pilot was killed. Nevertheless, the building was opened with great fanfare. All of the guests went inside and into the Senate chamber that you can see in this lovely painting from Ivor Heel, which is in the museum's collection. The dark red of the Senate chamber, filled to the brim with spectators, was modelled on, of course, the British House of Lords chamber. Now I'd like to talk about one particularly fascinating parliamentarian, Australia's first Indigenous senator, Neville Bonner. He was a trailblazer and a remarkable man. Neville Bonner was born in 1922 on a little island, Eucharabar Island, on the Tweed River, northern New South Wales. His mother died at an early age when he was 10, and he was raised by his extended family, especially his grandmother, Ida. His family was very poor and they moved around from place to place. And young Neville had almost no education. So Neville was working from a young age. He moved a lot around New South Wales and Queensland, working a whole variety of jobs. Eventually he married his first wife Mona and moved out to Palm Island off the coast of Queensland, where her family was based. And that's where Neville really got into politics. And he decided very early on that to improve conditions for Aboriginal people, which were very poor on the whole at the time, that he needed to work within the existing system, to work with white Australians to be able to change laws and make things better. Now that caused him a lot of grief later in his life when he entered formal politics, but on Palm Island he really was able to exercise those skills of oratory and informal politics that he was to use later in Parliament itself. When Neville Bonner was sworn in as a senator for Queensland in 1971 on this Bible, which is held in the museum's collections, he was an enormously proud man. He was proud to represent his state, but he was also proud to represent his race, and those were his priorities when he was in Parliament. Neville Bonner was a man of great principle and he used to vote according to those principles. He crossed the floor many times to vote against his colleagues, which used to cause him a lot of grief amongst them as well. Some of the items relating to Neville Bonner in our collection show a different side of the man, and Neville Bonner was a very keen golfer. We have these small items relating to his love of golfing in the collection as well. He often said that golf and politics were very similar. The cut and thrust of debate on the chamber and the votes there were very similar to competitions on the golf links as well. He loved his golf. These final two objects relating to Neville Bonner that we have in the collection show the esteem in which he was really held, particularly towards the end of his life when he was made a life member of the Liberal Party of Australia. Neville Bonner had left the Liberal Party for a short while after he had been placed in an unwinnable position for the 1983 election, but he later came to be embraced by the party. He was awarded the Order of Australia. Neville Bonner died just a year later in 1999 and has been named in many different ways around the country, reflecting the fact that he was held in such high esteem. Although women in Australia had gained the right to stand for Parliament in 1902, it took a long time, another 41 years, before those first two women actually did walk through the doors of Old Parliament House. It wasn't for lack of trying. In 1903, 4 women had stood for Parliament unsuccessfully. And one of those, Vida Goldstein, who had fought for the vote for women for many, many years, stood 5 times in subsequent elections unsuccessfully. But in 1943, Dame Enid Lyons and Dame Dorothy Tangney were successful. Dorothy Tangney was elected a senator for Western Australia, and she entered the Red Chamber, and Dame Enid Lyons was elected for a seat in Tasmania and entered the House of Representatives. Now, Enid Lyons was well known to many Australians. She was the wife of the former Prime Minister Joseph Lyons, Australia's 10th Prime Minister. She had lived in the Lodge, the Prime Minister's residence here in Canberra for many years with their 11 children. She'd raised the children and she'd been a confidant and support for her husband for many, many years. She knew the political system. When Joseph Lyons died in office in 1939 as Prime Minister, Enid was devastated. She sank into a bit of a depression, and it was some years later that one of her daughters suggested to her that she stand for the division of Darwin in northern Tasmania and enter politics herself. She decided to give it a go, and she was successful in the 1943 election. Now, when she entered the building, Enid Lyons had some idea that it was pretty unusual for a woman to be in that place. And I'm going to read a few words, a few lines from her maiden speech in 1943, which give us some indication of what she was thinking about what it was like to be the first woman in the House of Representatives. She said at that time, "I believe that any woman entering the public arena must be prepared to work as men work. She must justify herself not as a woman, but as a citizen. She must attack the same problems, be prepared to shoulder the same burdens." Enid Lyons was the first woman to serve in federal cabinet when Prime Minister Robert Menzies appointed her Vice President of the Executive Council. But she was not given a portfolio, and she used to joke, somewhat wryly, I like to think, that her main duty in cabinet was to pour the tea. That's all we have time for today. I hope you've enjoyed hearing some of the stories about the beautiful building, Old Parliament House, here in the nation's capital, and two of the remarkable trailblazing politicians who worked there.